Section 25 of Within a Budding Grove by Marcel Proust. Translated by C.K. Scott Moncrief. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kristen Hand. Place Names the Place, Part 6. But I was obliged to take my eyes from Mademoiselle d'Estermaria, for already, considering no doubt that making the acquaintance of an important person was a brief, inquisitive act which was sufficient in itself, and to bring out all the interest that was latent in it required only a handshake and a penetrating stare, without either immediate conversation or any subsequent relations. Her father had taken leave of the barrister and returned to sit down facing her, rubbing his hands like a man who has just made a valuable acquisition. As for the barrister, once the first emotion of this interview had subsided, then, as on other days, he could be heard every minute addressing the head waiter. "But I am not a king, I may. Go and attend to the king. I say, chief, those little trout don't look at all bad, do they? We must ask I may to let us have some. I may, that little fish you have over there looks to me highly commendable. Will you bring us some, please, I may, and don't be sparing with it." He would repeat the name I may all day long, one result of which was that when he had anyone to dinner, the guest would remark, "I can see you are quite at home in this place," and would feel himself obliged to keep on saying I may, also, from that tendency, combining elements of timidity, vulgarity, and silliness, which many people have, to believe that it is smart and witty to copy to the letter what is said by the company in which they may happen to be. The barrister repeated the name incessantly, but with a smile, for he felt that he was exhibiting at once the good terms on which he stood with the head waiter and his own superior station. And the head waiter, whenever he caught the sound of his own name, smiled too, as though touched and at the same time proud, showing that he was conscious of the honor and could appreciate the pleasantry. Terrifying as I always found these meals, in the vast restaurant, generally full of the Mammoth Hotel, they became even more terrifying when there arrived for a few days the proprietor, or he may have been only the general manager, appointed by a board of directors, not only of this palace, but of 7 or 8 more besides, situated at all the 4 corners of France, in each of which, traveling continuously, he would spend a week now and again. Then, just after dinner had begun, there appeared every evening in the doorway of the dining-room this small man with white hair and a red nose, astonishingly neat and impassive, who was known, it appeared, as well in London as at Monte Carlo, as one of the leading hotel-keepers in Europe. Once when I had gone out for a moment at the beginning of dinner, as I came in again I passed close by him, and he bowed to me, but with a coldness in which I could not distinguish whether it should be attributed to the reserve of a man who could never forget what he was, or to his contempt for a customer of so little importance. To those whose importance was considerable, the managing director would bow, with quite as much coldness, but more deeply, lowering his eyelids with a reverence that was almost offended modesty, as though he had found himself confronted at a funeral with the father of the deceased or with the Blessed Sacrament. Except for these icy and infrequent salutations, he made not the slightest movement, as if to show that his glittering eyes, which appeared to be starting out of his head, saw everything, controlled everything, assured to us in the hotel dinner perfection in every detail as well as a general harmony. He felt, evidently, that he was more than the producer of a play, than the conductor of an orchestra, nothing less than a general in supreme command. Having decided that a contemplation carried to its utmost intensity would suffice to assure him that everything was in readiness, that no mistake had been made which could lead to disaster, to invest him, in a word, with full responsibility, he abstained not merely from any gesture, but even from moving his eyes, which, petrified by the intensity of their gaze, took in and directed everything that was going on. I felt that even the movements of my spoon did not escape him, and were he to vanish after the soup, for the whole dinner the review that he had held would have taken away my appetite. His own was exceedingly good, as one could see at luncheon, which he took like an ordinary guest of the hotel, at a table that anyone else might have had in the public dining-room. His table had this peculiarity only, that by his side, while he was eating, the other manager, the resident one, remained standing all the time to make conversation. For being subordinate to this managing director, he was anxious to please a man of whom he lived in constant fear. My fear of him diminished during these luncheons, for being then lost in the crowd of visitors, he would exercise the discretion of a general sitting in a restaurant, where there are also private soldiers, in not seeming to take any notice of them. Nevertheless, when the porter from among a cluster of pages announced to me, "He leaves tomorrow morning for Dinard, then he's going down to Biarritz, and after that to Cannes," I began to breathe more freely. My life in the hotel was rendered not only dull because I had no friends there, but uncomfortable because Francois had made so many. It might be thought that they would have made things easier for us in various respects. Quite the contrary. The proletariat, if they succeeded only with great difficulty in being treated as people she knew by Francois, and could not succeed at all unless they fulfilled the condition of showing the utmost politeness to her, were, on the other hand, once they had reached the position, the only people who counted. Her time-honored code taught her that she was in no way bound to the friends of her employers, that she might, if she was busy, shut the door without ceremony in the face of a lady who had come to call on my grandmother. But towards her own acquaintance, that is to say, the select handful of the lower orders whom she admitted to an unconquerable intimacy, her actions were regulated by the most subtle and most stringent of protocols. Thus, Francois, having made the acquaintance of the man in the coffee shop, and of a little maid who did dressmaking for a Belgian lady, no longer came upstairs immediately after luncheon to get my grandmother's things ready, but came an hour later, because the coffee man had wanted to make her a cup of coffee or a tisane in his shop, or the maid had invited her to go and watch her sew, and to refuse either of them would have been impossible, and one of the things that were not done. Moreover, particular attention was due to the little sewing maid, who was an orphan that had been brought up by strangers, to whom she still went occasionally for a few days' holiday. Her unusual situation aroused Francois's pity, and also a benevolent contempt. She, who had a family, a little house that had come to her from her parents, with a field in which her brother kept his cows, how could she regard so uprooted a creature as her equal? And since this girl hoped, on Assumption Day, to be allowed to pay her benefactors a visit, Francois kept on repeating, "She does make me laugh. She says, 'I hope to be going home for the Assumption.' 'Home?' says she. 'It isn't just that it's not her own place. There are people who took her in from nowhere, and the creature says, 'Home,' just as if it really was her home." Poor girl! What a wretched state she must be in, not to know what it is to have a home. Still, if Francois had associated only with the ladies' maids brought to the hotel by other visitors, who fed with her in the service quarters, and seeing her grand lace cap and her handsome profile, took her perhaps for some lady of noble birth, whom reduced circumstances or a personal attachment had driven to serve as a companion to my grandmother, if, in a word, Francois had known only people who did not belong to the hotel, no great harm would have been done, since she could not have prevented them from doing us any service, for the simple reason that in no circumstances, even without her knowledge, would it have been possible for them to serve us at all. But she had formed connections also with one of the wine waiters, with the man in the kitchen, and with the head chambermaid of our landing. And the result of this in our everyday life was that Francois, who on the day of her arrival, when she still did not know anyone, would set all the bells jangling for the slightest thing, at an hour when my grandmother and I would never have dared to ring, and if we offered some gentle admonition, answered, "Well, we're paying enough for it, aren't we?" As though it were she herself that would have to pay. Nowadays, since she had made friends with the personage in the kitchen, which had appeared to us to augur well for our future comfort, were my grandmother or I to complain of cold feet, Francois, even at an hour that was quite normal, dared not ring. She assured us that it would give offense, because they would have to light the furnace again, or because it would interrupt the servants' dinner, and they would be annoyed. And she ended with a formula that, in spite of the ambiguous way in which she uttered it, was none the less clear, and put us plainly in the wrong. The fact is, we did not insist, for fear of bringing upon ourselves another far more serious "it's a matter." So that it amounted to this: but we could no longer have any hot water because Francois had become a friend of the man who would have to heat it. In the end, we too formed a connection in spite of, but through, my grandmother, for she and Madame de Villaparisis came in collision one morning in a doorway, and were obliged to accost each other, not without having first exchanged gestures of surprise and hesitation, performed movements of recoil and uncertainty, and finally uttered protestations of joy and greeting, as in some of Molière's plays, where two actors who have been delivering long soliloquies from opposite sides of the stage, a few feet apart, are supposed not to have seen each other yet, and then suddenly catch sight of each other, cannot believe their eyes, break off what they are saying, and finally address each other, the chorus having meanwhile kept the dialogue going, and fall into each other's arms. Madame de Villaparisis was tactful, and made as if to leave my grandmother to herself after the first greetings, but my grandmother insisted on her staying to talk to her until luncheon, being anxious to discover how her friend managed to get her letters sent up to her earlier than we got ours, and to get such nice grilled things. For Madame de Villaparisis, a great epicure, had the poorest opinion of the hotel kitchen which served us with meals that my grandmother, still quoting Madame de Sévigné, described as of a magnificence to make you die of hunger. And the Marquise, forming the habit of coming every day until her own meal was ready, to sit down for a moment at our table in the dining room, insisting that we should not rise from our chairs or in any way put ourselves out. At the most, we would linger, as often as not, in the room after finishing our luncheon to talk to her, at that sordid moment when the knives are left littering the tablecloth among crumpled napkins. For my own part, so as to preserve, in order that I might be able to enjoy Balbec, the idea that I was on the uttermost promontory of the earth, I compelled myself to look farther afield, to notice only the sea, to seek in it the effects described by Baudelaire, and to let my gaze fall upon our table only on days when there was set on it some gigantic fish, some marine monster, which, unlike the knives and forks, was contemporary with the primitive epochs in which the ocean first began to teem with life, in the Cimmerian's time. A fish whose body, with its numberless vertebrae, its blue veins and red, had been constructed by nature, but according to an architectural plan, like a polychrome cathedral of the deep. As a barber, seeing an officer whom he is accustomed to shave with special deference and care recognize a customer who has just entered the shop and stop for a moment to talk to him, rejoices in the thought that these are two men of the same social order, and cannot help smiling as he goes to fetch the bowl of soap, for he knows that in his establishment, to the vulgar routine of a mere barber's shop are being added social, not to say aristocratic pleasures. So I may, seeing that Madame de Villaparisis had found in us old friends, went to fetch our finger bowls with precisely the smile, proudly modest and knowingly discreet, of a hostess who knows when to leave her guests to themselves. He suggested also a pleased and loving father who looks on without interfering at the happy pair who have plighted their troth at his hospitable board. Besides, it was enough merely to utter the name of a person of title for Aimée to appear pleased, unlike Francois, before whom you could not mention Count So-and-so without her face darkening and her speech becoming dry and sharp, all of which meant that she worshipped the aristocracy not less than Aimée, but far more. But then Francois had that quality which in others she condemned as the worst possible fault. She was proud. She was not of that friendly and good-humored race to which Aimée belonged. They exhibit an intense delight when you tell them a piece of news which may be more or less sensational, but is at any rate new, and not to be found in the papers. Francois declined to appear surprised. You might have announced in her hearing that the Archduke Rudolph, not that she had the least suspicion of his having ever existed, was not, as was generally supposed, dead, but alive and kicking, she would have answered only yes, as though she had known it all the time. It may, however, have been that if even from our own lips, from us whom she so meekly called her masters, who had so nearly succeeded in taming her, she could not, without having to check an angry start, hear the name of a noble that was because the family from which she had sprung occupied in its own village a comfortable and independent position, and was not to be threatened in the consideration which it enjoyed save by those same nobles, in whose households, meanwhile, from his boyhood, an Aimée would have been domiciled as a servant, if not actually brought up by their charity. Of Francois, then, Madame de Villaparisis must ask pardon first for her nobility. But, in France at any rate, that is precisely the talent, in fact the sole occupation of our great gentlemen and ladies. Francois, following the common tendency of servants, who pick up incessantly from the conversation of their masters with other people fragmentary observations from which they are apt to draw erroneous inductions, as the human race generally does with respect to the habits of animals, was constantly discovering that somebody had failed us, a conclusion to which she was easily led, not so much perhaps by her extravagant love for us, as by the delight that she took in being disagreeable to us. But having once established, without possibility of error, the endless little attentions paid to us, and paid to herself also by Madame de Villaparisis, Francois forgave her for being a marquise, and, as she had never ceased to be proud of her because she was one, preferred her thenceforward to all our other friends. It must be added that no one else took the trouble to be so continually nice to us. Whenever my grandmother remarked on a book that Madame de Villaparisis was reading, or said she had been admiring the fruit which someone had just sent to our friend, within an hour the footman would come to our rooms with book or fruit. And the next time we saw her, in response to our thanks, she would only say, seeming to seek some excuse for the meagreness of her present in some special use to which it might be put, "It's nothing wonderful, but the newspapers come so late here, one must have something to read." Or, "It is always wiser to have fruit one can be quite certain of at the seaside." "But I don't believe I've ever seen you eating oysters," she said to us, increasing the sense of disgust which I felt at that moment, for the living flesh of the oyster revolted me even more than the gumminess of the stranded jellyfish defiled for me the beach at Balbec. "They are delicious down here. Oh, let me tell my maid to fetch your letters when she goes for mine." "What? Your daughter writes every day? But what on earth can you find to say to each other?" My grandmother was silent, but it may be assumed that her silence was due to scorn, in her who used to repeat, when she wrote to mamma, the words of Madame de Sévigné: "As soon as I have received a letter, I want another at once. I cannot breathe until it comes. There are few who are worthy to understand what I mean." And I was afraid of her applying to Madame de Villaparisis the conclusion, "I seek out those who are of the chosen few, and I avoid the rest." She fell back upon praise of the fruit which Madame de Villaparisis had sent us the day before. And this had been indeed so fine that the manager, in spite of the jealousy aroused by our neglect of his official offerings, has said to me, "I am like you. I am madder about fruit than any other kind of dessert." My grandmother told her friend that she enjoyed them all the more because the fruit which we got in the hotel was generally horrid. "I cannot," she went on, "say, like Madame de Sévigné, that if we should take a sudden fancy for bad fruit, we should be obliged to order it from Paris." "Oh, yes, of course you read Madame de Sévigné. I saw you with her letters the day you came." She forgot she had never officially seen my grandmother in the hotel until their collision in the doorway. "Don't you find it rather exaggerated, her constant anxiety about her daughter? She refers to it too often to be really sincere. She is not natural." My grandmother felt that any discussion would be futile, and so as not to be obliged to speak of the things she loved to a person incapable of understanding them, concealed by laying her bag upon them the Memoirs de Mademoiselle de Beausergent. Were she to encounter Francois at the moment, which Francois called the noon, when, wearing her fine cap and surrounded with every mark of respect, she was coming downstairs to feed with the service, Madame Villaparisis would stop her to ask after us. And Francois, when transmitting to us the Marquess's message, "She said to me, 'You'll be sure and bid them good day,' she said," counterfeited the voice of Madame de Villaparisis, whose exact words she imagined herself to be quoting textually, whereas she was really corrupting them no less than Plato corrupts the words of Socrates, or St. John the words of Jesus. Francois, as was natural, was deeply touched by these attentions. Only she did not believe my grandmother, but supposed that she must be lying in the interest of her class, the rich always combining thus to support one another, when she assured us that Madame de Villaparisis had been lovely as a young woman. It was true that of this loveliness only the faintest trace remained, from which no one, unless he happened to be a great deal more of an artist than Francois, would have been able to restore her ruined beauty. For in order to understand how beautiful an elderly woman can once have been, one must not only study, but interpret every line of her face. I must remember sometime to ask her whether I'm not right, after all, in thinking that there is some connection with the Guermantes, said my grandmother, to my great indignation. How could I be expected to believe in a common origin uniting two names which had entered my consciousness, one through the low and shameful gate of experience, the other by the golden gate of imagination? We had several times in the last few days seen driving past us in a stately equipage, tall, auburn, handsome, with a rather prominent nose, the Princess de Luxembourg, who was staying in the neighborhood for a few weeks. Her carriage had stopped outside the hotel. A footman had come in and spoken to the manager, had gone back to the carriage, and had reappeared with a most amazing armful of fruit, which combined in a single basket, like the bay itself, different seasons, with a card, La Princesse de Luxembourg, on which were scrawled a few words in pencil. For what princely traveller sojourning here incognito could they be intended, those glaucous plums, luminous and spherical as was at that moment the circumfluent sea, transparent grapes clustering on a shriveled stick like a fine day in autumn, pears of a heavenly ultramarine? For it could not be on my grandmother's friend that the princess had meant to pay a call. And yet on the following evening Madame de Villeparissus sent us the bunch of grapes, cool, liquid, golden, plums, too, and pears, which we remembered, though the plums had changed, like the sea at our dinner hour, to a dull purple, and on the ultramarine surface of the pears there floated the forms of a few rosy clouds. A few days later we met Madame de Villeparissus as we came away from the symphony concert that was given every morning on the beach. Convinced that the music to which I had been listening, the prelude to Lohengrin, the overture to Tannhauser, and such like, expressed the loftiest of truths, I was trying to elevate myself as far as I could, so as to attain to a comprehension of them. I was extracting from myself so as to understand them, and was attributing to them all that was best and most profound in my own nature at that time. Well, as we came out of the concert, and on our way back to the hotel, had stopped for a moment on the front, my grandmother and I, for a few words with Madame de Villeparissus, who told us that she had ordered some croquettes monsieurs and a dish of creamed eggs for us at the hotel. I saw, a long way away, coming in our direction, the Princesse de Luxembourg, half leaning upon a parasol, in such a way as to impart to her tall and wonderful form that slight inclination, to make it trace that arabesque dear to the women who had been beautiful under the Empire, and knew how, with drooping shoulders, arched backs, concave hips, and bent legs, to make their bodies float as gently as a silken scarf about the rigidity of the invisible stem which might be supposed to have been passed diagonally through them. She went out every morning for a turn on the beach, almost at the time when everyone else, after bathing, was climbing home to luncheon, and as hers was not until 1:30, she did not return to her villa until long after the hungry bathers had left the scorching front a desert. Madame de Villeparissus presented my grandmother and would have presented me, but had first to ask me my name, which she could not remember. She had perhaps never known it, or if she had, must have forgotten years ago to whom my grandmother had married her daughter. My name, when she did hear it, appeared to impress Madame de Villeparissus considerably. Meanwhile the Princesse de Luxembourg had given us her hand, and now and again, while she conversed with the Marquess, turned to bestow a kindly glance on my grandmother and myself, with that embryonic kiss which we put into our smiles when they are addressed to a baby out with its nana. Indeed, in her anxiety not to appear to be a denizen of a higher sphere than ours, she had probably miscalculated the distance there was indeed between us, for by an error in adjustment she made her eyes beam with such benevolence that I could see the moment approaching when she would put out her hand and stroke us, as if we were two nice beasts and had poked our heads out at her through the bars of our cage in the gardens. And immediately as it happened, this idea of caged animals and the Bois de Boulogne received striking confirmation. It was the time of day at which the beach is crowded by itinerant and clamorous vendors, hawking cakes and sweets and biscuits. Not knowing quite what to do to show her affection for us, the princess hailed the next that came by. He had nothing left but one rye cake, of the kind one throws to the ducks. The princess took it and said to me, "For your grandmother." And yet it was to me that she held it out, saying with a friendly smile, "You shall give it to her yourself." Thinking that my pleasure would thus be more complete if there were no intermediary between myself and the animals. Other vendors came up. She stuffed my pockets with everything that they had, tied up in packets, comfits, sponge cakes, sugar sticks. "You will eat some yourself," she told me, "and give some to your grandmother." And she had the vendors paid by the little Negro page dressed in red satin, who followed her everywhere and was a 9 days' wonder upon the beach. Then she said good-bye to Madame de Villaparisis, and held out her hand to us with the intention of treating us in the same way as she treated her friend, as people whom she knew, and of bringing herself within our reach. But this time she must have reckoned our level as not quite so low on the scale of creation, for her and our equality was indicated by the princess to my grandmother by that tender and maternal smile which a woman gives a little boy when she says good-bye to him as though to a grown-up person. By a miraculous stride in evolution, my grandmother was no longer a duck or an antelope, but had already become what the Anglophile Madame Swann would have called a baby. Finally, having taken leave of us all, the princess resumed her stroll along the basking front, curving her splendid shape, which, like a serpent coiled about a wand, was interlaced with the white parasol patterned in blue which Madame de Luxembourg held, unopened, in her hand. She was my first royalty. I say my first, for strictly speaking, Princess Matilda did not count. The second, as we shall see in due course, was to astonish me no less by her indulgence. One of the ways in which our great nobles, kindly intermediaries between commoners and kings, can befriend us, was revealed to me next day when Madame de Villaparisis reported, "She thought you quite charming. She is a woman of the soundest judgment, the warmest heart, not like so many queens and people. She has real merit." And Madame de Villaparisis went on in a tone of conviction, and quite thrilled to be able to say it to us, "I am sure she would be delighted to see you again." But on that previous morning, after we had parted from the Princess de Luxembourg, Madame de Villaparisis said a thing which impressed me far more, and was not prompted merely by friendly feeling. "Are you," she had asked me, "the son of the permanent secretary at the ministry?" "Indeed. I am told your father is a most charming man. He is having a splendid holiday just now." A few days earlier we had heard, in a letter from mamma, that my father and his friend Monsieur de Norpois had lost their luggage. "It has been found, as a matter of fact. It was never really lost. I can tell you what happened," explained Madame de Villaparisis, who, without our knowing how, seemed to be far better informed than ourselves of the course of my father's travels. "I think your father is now planning to come home earlier, next week, in fact, as he will probably give up the idea of going to Algeciras. But he is anxious to devote a day longer to Toledo. It seems he is an admirer of a pupil of Titian, I forget the name, whose work can only be seen properly there." I asked myself by what strange accident, in the impartial glass through which Madame de Villaparisis considered, from a safe distance, the bustling, tiny, purposeless agitation of the crowd of people whom she knew, there had come to be inserted at the spot through which she observed my father a fragment of prodigious magnifying power, which made her see in such high relief and in the fullest detail everything there was attractive about him, the contingencies that were obliging him to return home, his difficulties with the customs, his admiration for El Greco, and, altering the scale of her vision, showed her this one man so large among the rest quite small, like that Jupiter to whom Gustave Moreau gave, when he portrayed him by the side of a weak mortal, a superhuman stature. My grandmother bade Madame de Villaparisis good-bye, so that we might stay and imbibe the fresh air for a little while longer outside the hotel, until they signaled to us through the glazed partition that our luncheon was ready. There were sounds of tumult. The young mistress of the king of the cannibal island had been down to bathe and was now coming back to the hotel. "Really and truly, it's a perfect plague. It's enough to make one decide to emigrate," cried the barrister, who had happened to cross her path in a towering rage. Meanwhile, the solicitor's wife was following the bogus queen with eyes that seemed ready to start from their sockets. I can't tell you how angry Madame Blondet makes me when she stares at those people like that, said the barrister to the chief magistrate. I feel I want to slap her. That is just the way to make the wretches appear important, and of course that's the very thing they want, that people should take an interest in them. Do ask her husband to tell her what a fool she's making of herself. I swear I won't go out with them again if they stop and gape at those masqueraders. As to the coming of the Princess de Luxembourg, whose carriage, on the day on which she left the fruit, had drawn up outside the hotel, it had not passed unobserved by the little group of wives, the solicitors, the barristers, and the magistrates, who had for some time past been most concerned to know whether she was a genuine marquise and not an adventuress, that Madame de Villeparissus, whom everyone treated with so much respect, which all these ladies were burning to hear that she did not deserve. Whenever Madame de Villeparissus passed through the hall, the chief magistrate's wife, who scented irregularities everywhere, would raise her eyes from her work and stare at the intruder in a way that made her friends die with laughter. "Oh, well, you know," she explained with lofty condescension, "I always begin by believing the worst. I will never admit that a woman is properly married until she has shown me her birth certificate and her marriage lines. But there's no need to alarm yourselves. Just wait till I have finished my little investigation." And so, day after day, the ladies would come together and laughingly ask one another, "Any news?" But on the evening after the Princess de Luxembourg's call, the magistrate's wife laid a finger on her lips. "I've discovered something." "Oh, isn't Madame Poncine simply wonderful? I never saw anyone. But do tell us what has happened." "Just listen to this. A woman with yellow hair and 6 inches of paint on her face and a carriage like you could smell it a mile off, which only a creature like that would dare to have, came here today to call on the Marquess by way of—" "Oh, yow, yow! Tut, 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 tut! Did you ever? Why, it must be that woman we saw. You remember, Leader, we said at the time we didn't like at all the look of her, but we didn't know that it was the Marquess she'd come to see. A woman with a nigger boy, you mean?" "That's the one." "Do you mean to say so? You don't happen to know her name?" "Yes. I made a mistake on purpose. I picked up her card. She trades under the name of the Princess de Luxembourg. Wasn't I right to have my doubts about her? It's a nice thing to have to mix promiscuously with a baronne d'Angers like that." The barrister quoted Mathurin Regnier's Macette to the chief magistrate. It must not, however, be supposed that this misunderstanding was merely temporary, like those that occur in the second act of a farce to be cleared up before the final curtain. Madame de Luxembourg, a niece of the King of England and of the Emperor of Austria, and Madame de Villeparissus, when one called to take the other for a drive, did look like nothing but 2 old trots of the kind one has always such difficulty in avoiding at a watering place. 9/10 of the men in the Faubourg Saint-Germain appear to the average man of the middle class simply as alcoholic wasters, which individually they not infrequently are, whom, therefore, no respectable person would dream of asking to dinner. The middle class fixes its standards in this respect too high, for the failings of these men would never prevent their being received with every mark of esteem in houses which it, the middle class, may never enter. And so sincerely do they believe that the middle class knows this, that they affect a simplicity in speaking of their own affairs and a tone of disparagement of their friends, especially when they are at the coast, which make the misunderstanding complete. If by any chance a man of the fashionable world is kept in touch with business people, because, having more money than he knows what to do with, he finds himself elected chairman of all sorts of important financial concerns, the businessman who at last sees a nobleman worthy, he considers, to rank with big business, would take his oath that such a man can have no dealings with the Marquis, ruined by gambling, whom the said businessman supposes to be all the more destitute of friends the more friendly he makes himself. And he cannot get over his surprise when the Duke, chairman of the board of directors of the colossal undertaking, arranges a marriage for his son with the daughter of that very Marquis, who may be a gambler, but who bears the oldest name in France, just as a sovereign would sooner see his son marry the daughter of a dethroned king than that of a president still in office. That is to say, the two worlds take as fantastic a view of one another as the inhabitants of a town situated at one end of Baalbek Bay have of the town at the other end. From Rivebelle you can just see Marcouville-la-Orgueille's, but even that is deceptive, for you imagine that you are seen from Marcouville, where, as a matter of fact, the splendors of Rivebelle are almost wholly invisible. End of section 25.